Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Modern Indian History we will be talking about origins of Indian National Congress. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Manoj Sharma. Dr. Sharma is Assistant Professor in Department of History in Kirorimal College, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. A very good afternoon to all the viewers. Today's topic of discussion is origins of Indian National Congress. Indian National Congress, which was started in 1885, was one of the most premier organizations which was associated with the Indian national movement. Though later it became a political party in the free or the independent India. And the kind of contribution which Indian National Congress made, which was popularly known as Congress during that particular period, was immense in the context that a number of political leaders, those who were associated with the Congress in various ways, they tried to create such a situation for the British that they should run away from India. The kind of phases in which the Congress leaders, they worked for the freedom of India. The initial phase was the phase of the moderates. The next phase was the phase of the extremists, and thereafter we see the Gandhian phase. So what we actually see is that Congress was working in the various phases, and in that particular context, the kind of work which it did, the kind of contribution it made to the national movement was immense. It was generally considered that Congress was initially started with the help of A.O. Hume, who was a retired civil servant and who was a British as well. So there was a myth which was associated with the origins of Congress in the context of the safety valve theory, that Congress was started with the intention or the aim of being a safety valve for the British. And on the other hand, it was also being argued that the people, those who were associated with the Congress, they wanted to use it as some sort of a lightning conductor. So in this way, what we actually see is that the contribution of Congress in terms of the national movement was immense. And secondly, it was also the central or the defining influence on the Indian national movement. And we can also argue that it was the first organized expression of the Indian nationalism. So in various ways, Congress was playing an important role in the political life of India, and the people, those who were associating themselves with the Congress, the people those who became the members of the Congress, they were also playing an important role in the context that they were participating in the national movement. So in this perspective, the origins of the Indian National Congress, they were very, very important, and how they were also playing an important role in this particular context could also be seen in this way. When we see the reasons for the origins of Congress, we see that the Indian Rebellion of 1857 or the revolt of 1857, it alarmed the British, and the British, they realized that how they were taken unawares because of this particular rebellion, and if they would not have sought a lot of support from the resources which they could generate, then it would have become such a situation that they would have been defeated in India. And how the transfer of India from the East India Company to the British Empire was another factor, that now when the East India Company had left and the British Crown had secured control over India, so now it wanted to govern India in the way it wished, and the kind of various policies which were being made by the British Parliament, the way it would be governed in the interest of the British Crown. At the same time, the goal of the Raj or the British Raj was to support and justify its governance in India. What we see is that the people, those who were associated with the government in India, they wanted to justify their rule as well, and for which they took support from the number of ideologies, for example, Orientalism, utilitarianism, evangelicalism. All these kind of ideas they were trying, and it was being argued that these ideological underpinnings they were in the way that British were considered to be the paternalism of the Raj was there in the Indian context, and it was also being argued that British, they were governing India for the benefit of the Indians, and the white men's burdens theory was also propagated, that British they were taking this kind of a burden to civilize the natives or the Indians, and Indians were in a way barbaric in nature, and they needed the British support to become civil in nature. So what they also realized, that Indians, they will be educated, and when they will be educated in the English language, then they will become in a way more sympathetic to the British culture and British language as well. And with this particular aim, they wanted that Indians, they should be more in a way receptive to the political thinking which was there in the British culture. And what we also see in the context of the debate which was there, that whether Congress emerged as a party with some sort of a safety valve. So there was some kind of a debate in which it was argued that Hume, he was asked by Dufferin, who was the Governor General at that time and the Viceroy, that he should start some kind of an organization, so that if Indians, they were dissatisfied in any way, so the British, they should come to know about that. From that perspective, Congress was started. So Indian National Congress in a way was started by A.O. Hume under the official direction of Lord Dufferin. It was being argued. So it will provide some sort of a safe and constitutional outlet for rising discontent among the masses. But when we see the historical proof of this theory, it was being provided that the secret reports that Hume saw in Shimla in 1878. And this kind of an idea could not be authentic in the context that Hume was the Secretary of the Department of Revenue, Commerce and Agriculture. So he could not see the Home Department files, and at the same times these files were kept in Delhi and not in Shimla. So the argument that it was a safety valve could not be seen authentic in the context that Hume could not have access to these kind of files. These kind of files were not kept in Shimla, and at the same time Hume was not there in the Home Department, rather he was in some other department, so he could not secure access to these files. Some kind of support which has been given is also in the framework of the Weddon Burns biography of Hume, in which it was also being argued that it was some kind of support from the British that the Congress emerged. And it was argued in this biography that there were 7 volumes which were shown to A.O. Hume by some of the gurus, those who had all these occult powers, and he was not there in Delhi, but from Shimla itself he could see all these kind of secret reports. So this kind of an idea was also being suggested, and W.C. Banerjee's statement in the Indian Politics in 1898, it argued that that Congress was originally started and it has since been carried on and is in reality the work of Marquis of Dufferin and Ava. And he also states that Hume was trying to bring leading Indian leaders together to discuss the social matters, but Dufferin asked Hume to start discussing politics so that government could keep itself informed of the Indian opinion. So this was the background to the origin of the Congress, how it was being started, and some of the people, those who believe that Congress was some sort of a safety valve for the British, they argue in this favor. And on the other hand, when we try to see the background of the rise of Indian National Congress, we see that the kind of conditions which were being created during the colonial or the British rule, they were also there for the rise of the Congress. Firstly, the discontent of the agrarian population due to the impoverishment under the colonial rule was one. Then the increasing burden of revenue and rent. Then the crippling of the handicraft industry in the form of deindustrialization, which created a lot of pressure on agriculture. And then the agricultural depression, which led to indebtedness. So what we see is that from the economic point of view, there were a number of factors for the rise of Congress, and these factors could be seen in the framework that how the people, they were suffering from the economic perspective under the colonial rule. And when this agrarian population was suffering under the colonial rule in terms of the revenue and the rent which was being paid by them, and how the handicraft industry, it also suffered. There is a debate also in the context of deindustrialization. There are proponents of deindustrialization, the people, those who advocate or support this idea that the Indian handicrafts industry, it totally vanished under the colonial rule, because the kind of machine made products which were being imported by the British from Manchester and other parts of Britain into India, because of which Indian handicraftsmen, they did not have those kind of resources that they could withstand the British onslaught of the machine made goods. So from that perspective, when we see that how the traditional Indian handicrafts industry suffered at the hands of the British, and which caused a lot of economic hardships to the people, those who were engaged in such kind of artisanal production. And these people, they also felt discontent, and at the same time these people, they shifted to agriculture. They did not have any kind of avenues to work in other sectors, and when they shifted to agriculture, then the pressure on agriculture also multiplied in a way. And when this kind of pressure multiplied on agriculture, which was also a lot of strain because of disguised unemployment during that particular period, and the production and the productivity was also comparatively low. And when that production and productivity was low and more people, they joined agriculture, then the productivity and the production further fell. And in this perspective, we also see a number of famines during this particular period in 19th century, that because of the decline in the production and productivity and the kind of policies which were being followed by the British, we see that a number of famines, they also took place. And when you are talking about the agricultural depression, then it also led to some kind of indebtedness among the farmers. And when farmers became indebted to the sahukar or the money lender, and the kind of pressure which was generated by the British on the agricultural sector, then farmers, they did not have any kind of choice, and they became more and more impoverished. In 60s and 70s, because of the famines, a lot of poverty and starvation could be seen, and this was reflected in a number of reports as well. And it was also seen in a number of riots which took place, for example the Deccan riots in 1875. There was another important aspect, was in the context of the tribals, when the forest resources, they were also appropriated by the British. The capitalist or the industrial class was also not given any kind of support by the British. There was no adequate tariff protection to the Indian industries during this particular period. There was increased taxation, and the realization of taxes involved corruption and oppression by the British. The renewed agitation against the income tax in 1870, in which the taxpayers, they wanted to know about the expenditure. All this was very well documented. And when we see in the context of the tribals, that how the forest reserves or the forest areas, they were appropriated by the British, so that they can give some kind of thrust to the railway sector, in which a lot of wood was required for the shipping industry, because British, they required a lot of ships so that the materials could be sent to Britain, and the finished products, they could be brought to India. And at the same time, the furniture needs of the British, they could also be met. So what we see is that a number of acts Forest Department was established in 1860s, and thereafter a number of acts they were being legislated, number of acts they came, and the thrust of the British was on this aspect that more and more areas of the forest they should be made into the reserve forest area, in which the locals, they should not be allowed to go for their subsistence activities. Traditionally, what was happening at the people, those who were living near the forest areas, it was being considered that they had their certain customary rights, and they had some kind of rights over the forest resources near which they were living. But what the British wanted to create was that they wanted to appropriate more and more areas into the reserve forest areas. Then the areas which were the village forest areas, they were made less as possible, because over these village forest areas the peoples they had some kind of customary rights. So the aim of the British was to exploit all these resources in such a way that they are able to make the maximum profits out of them. And on the other hand, the capitalist class was also not getting any kind of support from the British in the context that the British, they were supporting the British capitalist, and the Indian capitalist class was not getting any kind of protection. Any kind of protection was not given to the Indian industries. Rather, the British industries, they were being protected or given all kinds of support by the British. What we also see during this particular period is that there was some kind of agitation in terms of education as well, because the government decided that if it will withdraw aid to the higher education, the British, they realized that when they were providing all these kind of educational facilities to the Indians, so Indians were becoming more and more aware about the kind of problems which were there in the Indian society. And when Indians, they were realizing that all these kind of problems had cropped up because of the colonial rule, then and when they were also becoming educated about the rationalist thought, they were also in the later part, they were also talking about the drain of wealth which was taking place from India to Britain, and how this drain of wealth was causing all sorts of economic hardships for the Indians and the impoverishment of the Indian economy. So all these kind of issues they were there. And when this kind of aid was withdrawn, which was there in the educational sector, then we find that the people, they started agitating, and this kind of agitation was a success as well. And Indians, they also wanted to study, as there were non-availability of adequate employment opportunities for the educated Indians. And when these kind of situation was there, then they took to law and journalism. And when they came into these kind of professions where they shifted to journalism, they started a number of newspapers as well. And when these newspapers, they were talking about the Indian the kind of policies which were being followed by the British in India, then people were becoming aware about all sorts of economic policies of the British, which were creating a lot of economic problems for India. And the people, they also came to law, so that if any kind of problems which were there, so they were able to understand these problems in a very legal manner. In the Viceroyalty of Lytton from 1876 to 1880, we also see that his policies were reactionary, discriminatory, exploitative and anti-Indian. And for example, he removed the import duties on sugar, so that sugar will be imported at a cheaper price. Then the expansionist war against Afghanistan, in which the expenditure was thrown on Indian exchequer, could also be seen. Then the Arms Act which came, which intended to make it impossible for Indians to offer any kind of resistance or even train themselves for defense. So what we see is that the kind of acts or the kind of policies which were being followed by the various governor generals during this particular period, and specifically Lytton, they were very harsh on Indians. And when the Vernacular Press Act was initiated during this particular period, it wanted to muzzle the press, the vernacular press, which was very critical of the British. So in this way, this act wanted that the vernacular press should not have any kind of freedom or rights, so that they should not in any way expose the wrongdoings of the colonial rule. The imperial darbar was also held in 1876 when millions were dying of the famine. That during that period a lot of money was wasted on the imperial darbar which was held in Delhi, and that money was not shifted so that people could get any kind of respite from their economic exploitation or economic misery. Then the reduction of the maximum age of the competitions of the Indian civil services examinations was also reduced from 21 to 19 years. So this also reduced the chances of the Indians, those who were entering the Indian civil services examinations, because the exam was taking place not in India but in Britain, and at the same time the kind of things which they had to read in Latin or English language, Latin, and the kind of text which they had to read, nothing to do with India. So it required a lot of professional understanding of the and training of the subject as well, which was not there for the Indians. For that, many Indians, they had to shift to Britain so that they could appear for these kind of examinations. And further, the age was also reduced, so the Indians, it will find more difficult to enter into the coveted Indian civil services. What we see during the time of Ripon, who became the Viceroy or the Governor General after Lytton, that the repeal of Vernacular Press Act takes place. So Indians, they became convinced that because of the constitutional agitation, as you can see on the screen as well, the constitutional agitation can also provide all kinds of fruits to them. Then Ilbert Bill, it was introduced, and it wanted to empower the Indian civilians of a rank of a DM or a sessions judge to try European offenders in Mofussil and Presidency Town. And there was a campaign against this bill by the Europeans and the Anglo-Indians, and the bill was modified and jury was added, that in the cases which were relating to the Europeans or the British, jury will be there, in which out of 15 members, 8 members will be of the European descent or American descent. So in this way, the purpose of this bill was also defeated. Ilbert Bill, which wanted to provide some kind of parity to the Indians, was taken away by the British. Then what we also see during the 1875 and 85 is that more and more people, they joined they became more and more nationalist intellectuals through studying or through education, and they also realized that the earlier associations were narrowly conceived, and the new generation started new associations, and some of the associations were formed. For example, Indian Association in 1876, and they were also trying to raise certain funds for promoting political agitation in India and England. So what we see is that during that particular period, a number of associations, they were also being formed, and they were also, and the people, those who were educated, the people, those who were communicating with each other in the English language, the people, those who were also starting a number of newspapers, they realized that they had to make some kind of concerted efforts at the all India level, so that they are able to in a way confront the British. And in this context, when Hume visited Bombay during that particular period, and Bombay Presidency Association was formed. Earlier, Madras Mahajan Sabha, then Indian Union Calcutta, then Indian Association, it sponsored a national conference in 1883. Then finally the Indian National Congress was started in 1885. So what we see is that various efforts at different levels, they bore fruit in some sense, and the origin of Congress could take place. So it would be very incorrect to say that only A.O. Hume was responsible for the origin of Congress, because what we see is that the kind of conditions which were there during this particular period, they were responsible for an organization called Congress, because the various people from different strata of society, from different regions of the country, they came together, And Congress did not emerge as a body in a form of a sudden effervescence, and the various political parties which were functioning in different parts of India, they came together in this context. Various associations, they also realized the need for another association which is all India in character, and then only it will be able to work for the Indians. And these kind of ferment of ideas, they prepared the ground for the origin of the Congress. And what we also see is that the emergence or the origin of INC was only a visible embodiment of that national awakening. People were becoming more and more aware, they were becoming more and more awakened that the British rule was trying to exploit them as more exploitation was taking during the colonial rule, and Indians will be further exploited if they will not throw the British out of India. So these kind of situation, this kind of realization at different levels, it provided some sort of a platform to the Indians which were there in the different parts of the country, and they started this venture or this kind of a body called the Indian National Congress. So when we try to retrospect, we say that even though that there are people, those who say that it was a safety valve, but the Indian nationalists, they wanted to use as some sort of a lightning conductor. And this kind of a debate is unending, that what was the reason for the origin of the Congress. And when you see the contribution that the Indian National Congress made, an immense contribution in this context, and finally it was able to succeed as well in the way that India was able to secure the independence. Though there were limitations in this context in the participation in Indian National Congress, but even then the role of the Indian National Congress in Indian independence could not be minimized, could not be undermined in any way. They made an immense contribution. The people or the leaders, those who were associated in the different phases of the Congress, made an immense contribution in the independence of India. So with this, I'd like to end my lecture or the discussion. Thank you so much. A very good afternoon to all the viewers. Today we will talk about moderates. Moderates were the people, those who were associated with the Indian National Congress, and this phase of the Indian National Congress was very significant from the perspective that it was the initial phase of the Indian National Congress. These people, they worked from 1885 to 1905. They were called as the Indian Liberals, and they were the initiators of the Congress in 1885. They dominated the first phase of Indian national movement, and they made immense contribution to the politics of the Congress. So what we see during the moderate phase of the Indian national movement is that moderates raised a number of demands so that the colonial government could listen to them, and their politics was based on the petition, prayer and protest, and that is why the extremist group of Congress, they called them as armed chair intellectuals and mendicants. So the kind of demands which were being raised by the moderates, they were quite progressive in nature, and at the same time they were not only talking about Indians, but at the same time they were also talking about Indians, those who were not living in India, the people, those who has been sent from India as indentured labor to other parts of the world. So they were talking about their concerns as well. So the politics of the moderates has been criticized a lot by the people. The next phase, for example, extremists and others as well, that they were always begging from the colonial or the British administrators. But at the same time, we have to realize that they were working in an environment where the colonial government had all the might to crush what they wanted to achieve. So initially their policies or their politics was based on such principles that they might not be repressed within the kind of repressive policies which were being followed by the British, and they believed in the policy of petition, prayer and protest, and they had some kind of innate faith in the colonial rule. They felt that British, they were just in nature, and because of their justness, the public opinion which was there in Britain, they were not aware about the exploitative policies of the British in India. So they have to create some kind of a climate in Britain, they have to create some kind of a public opinion in Britain, so that they become aware of the policies which were being followed by the British in India. And they were also believers in the gradualism and constitutionalism. They believed that gradually over a period of time they will be able to achieve their objective, and through the constitutional means, the kind of policies, the kind of practices which they followed, they were more constitutional in nature. And the critics, they argue that they were in a way the mendicants, they were the armchair intellectuals in the way. And the kind of demands which were raised by them, first was the simultaneous examinations for the Indian civil services in India and abroad, separation of judiciary from executive, organization of provincial councils, reduction of military expenditure, repeal of Arms Act, abolition or reconstitution of Indian Council, introduction of permanent settlement to other parts of India. So what we see is that the varied kind of demands they were being raised in the economic sphere, political sphere, social sphere. So they were not only thinking about the political sphere, but their concerns were also economic, social and cultural as well, because their demands were varied in nature. And that is why they wanted that the judiciary should be separated from the executive. They also wanted that Indianization of the civil services should take place. More and more Indians, they should become part of the civil services, because they felt that if civil services will be Indianized, then less salaries will be paid to the Indians, because hefty sums of amounts or money was paid to the British civil servants in India. Secondly, they also felt that the Indian people, when they will become civil servants, then they will be more sympathetic to the concerns of the Indians, because British, they were not from the Indian culture, so they will not be sympathetic from that perspective. And on the other hand, the Indians, they will be more sympathetic to the kind of situation which was being prevailing in India. And they were also framing policies, or they were also asking to frame policies from the British, that the permanent settlement, it should be spread to other parts of India. It was an economic measure. They realized that people, they were suffering, especially the peasants, they were suffering under the colonial rule. And in the political sphere, they wanted to reconstitute the Indian Council. They were also questioning the Indian military expenditure, and the military expenditure which was taking place in different wars which Britain fought against the other nations of the world. So their concerns were there in the national context in the different fields. They also were against the repeal of the Ilbert Bill. Ilbert Bill, which was introduced during the viceroyalty of Ripon, and it wanted to give some kind of parity to the Indians, so that they could also decide the cases of the Europeans. It was also, the repeal of the Ilbert Bill was opposed by them. They also wanted racial equality for the Indians, and the Indian indentured labor which went to other parts of the world. Then the liberation of women and the dilution of the caste divisions. It was an important aspect which was also dealt in the social religious reform movements as well. And the people, those who were associated with the Congress in the initial phase, they also wanted to dilute the divisions which were based on caste. And we also see that Gokhale was one member of the Congress who was considered a liberal, and he raised this move that in a private member's bill that the primary education should be made compulsory. So all these kind of issues which were dealing with various aspects, for example, education was an important sector during that particular period, and they realized that if you will provide the elementary or the primary education to the Indians in a free manner, then more and more Indians, they will become aware about the situation of India. So this is how they realized the kind of situation which was prevailing in India, and they tried to justify their situation by getting into debates with the British in the various platforms where they were given some kind of a representation at political level, so that not only the British government will come to know about the viewpoint, but also when all these kind of things they will be reported in the press, then the Indian people will also come to know about the kind of demands which have been made by the people, those who were in these various bodies. They also demanded that the Indian control should be there over the public purse, as you can see on the screen as well. They also adopted a slogan that has been used earlier during the struggle of independence by the Americans, that no taxation without representation. They demanded self-rule or Swaraj for the Indians within the colonial empire on the model of the self-governing colonies like Canada or Australia, and these demands were raised by Gokhale and Nauroji, Dadabhai Nauroji, in the Congress sessions in 1905 and 1906. So what we see is that the kind of demands which were raised by the moderates at different platforms, they were asking that more and more Indians they should be engaged in the administration of India. And when they were talking about Swaraj, initially they talked about a Swaraj in which was there for other nations as well. For example, in Canada, the kind of Swaraj which was given to the Canada or Australia, in which they will work under the British Empire. But later these kind of demands were made in such a way that they did not want any kind of British interference over a period of time. And Tilak, he argued that Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. So these kind and different interpretations of Swaraj were given by the leaders, those who were engaged in the national movement. These leaders, they had their own vision of Swaraj, and they tried to explain that vision of Swaraj. And over a period of time, all of them, they realized as well that the ultimate objective of the national movement was to secure some kind of independence from the colonial rule. And when we make an economic assessment of the impact of the British rule, the moderates, they were quite successful in that. The kind of theory which they put forward, which was known as the drain of wealth theory, in which Dadabhai Nauroji, R.C. Dutt, etc., they made an important contribution. They calculated the kind of drain which had taken place, and these kind of calculations were there for everybody to see. And when these kind of calculations were presented to the Indian masses, the Indians, they became aware. For example, they highlighted the reality of the Indian poverty and the economic backwardness. They also linked it that the British exploitation was leading to the problems in the India's economic resources. Then the Nauroji computed the amount of drain at 8 million pounds annually, and R.C. Dutt, he estimated at 20 million pounds a year during early 20th century. So what we see is that the kind of points, the kind of economic analysis which was being done by the moderates during that particular period, and this economic analysis was quite empirical in nature. They took when this amount was computed, they took note of the kind of imports and the exports which were taking in terms of the monetary transactions during that particular period. They also calculated the kind of impact which if the resources would have been in India, if the resources would not have been taken out of India, the kind of progress the Indians would have made if these resources would not have been taken out of India. So all these kind of issues, that how the issue of drain of wealth was related to the economic backwardness of India, how it was creating a situation of poverty and famines in India, and how it was also leading to prosperity in Britain and other parts of the world where British were ruling. So that was also being argued by the moderates on empirical basis. So their ideas were quite rational in nature. The kind of demands which they made, they were also rational in nature, and their critique of the economic aspect was also very, very rational. So from that perspective, they made an important contribution, in the sense that all these assessments, they were made known to the Indian public, and the Indian public became aware of the kind of economic and the exploitative character of the colonial rule. What we also see is that this economic criticism, it was also undermining the legitimacy of the colonial rule, because British, they were arguing that their rule was legitimate. They also highlighted the decline of traditional handicrafts. Nauroji raised the question of state patronage for the development of native industries. Gokhale talked about protectionism to Indian industries. He raised slogan "No taxation without representation." He drew attention to high salaries of British officials. So what we see is that the economic critique of colonialism, it was undermining the legitimacy of the colonial rule. The British, they were arguing that their rule was justified in India. When they were ruling India, they were trying to improve Indians, they were trying to civilize Indians, and they were in a way giving some kind of thrust to the Indian economy, and all this was based on the false premise. All this was inauthentic in nature, it was totally incorrect, and the Indians, they wanted to project, for example, moderates, the people those who were associated with the moderate politics, the people those who were the economists, and they had done some kind of a critical analysis of the economic impact of the colonial rule. They argued that the drain of wealth was quite heavy, and when this drain of wealth was taking place, the British, they also lost the legitimacy which they were crying, which they were arguing that they were the legitimate rulers, and they were working for the betterment of the Indians. So all this was rejected by the moderates. The arguments were put forward by them that how British, the claims of the British were totally hollow in that sense, and they were not in any way beneficial to the Indians. So all this kind of economic assessment, in a way, opened the eyes of the Indians. It created some kind of awareness amongst the Indians, and when the movement became ripe, for example, during the Gandhian phase, when the movement became ripe, when a lot of mass mobilization takes place, then all the earlier kinds of economic exploitation which had already taken place during the colonial rule, that was also being cited. So they made an important contribution from that perspective, and at the same time, the various leaders like Gokhale, Nauroji, they were quite well trained. And when they were well trained in the Indian politics and the Indian economic theory, they put forward their ideas at different platforms, and when their ideas got popularized at these platforms, they also entered the press. So in a way, these kind of ideas reached the masses as well. For example, Gokhale talked about the high salaries of the British officials, and when these hefty salaries or the high salaries, they were being paid to the British officials, so they were also some sort of a drain on the Indian resources. And at the same time, these people, they were also paid high pensions when they went to Britain, and these pensions were also paid from the Indian exchequer. So all these kind of issues which were economic in nature, they were being highlighted by the moderates in their critique of the colonial rule. They also made some of the major economic demands during that particular period. For example, you can see on the screen as well that decrease in the land revenue, they argued, so that the burden of the taxation on peasants, that could be reduced. End of the economic drain from India. abolition of the salt tax, reduction in high military expenditure of government of India. So when you see the major economic demands which were raised by the moderates, they were arguing for the peasants, where they were arguing that land revenue should be reduced. They were also arguing for the other sections of the society. For example, the abolition of the salt tax, which was some sort of a drain on everybody. Then the military expenditure which was being incurred by the government of India in the various wars which were being fought. So moderates, they were aware about the various kinds of expenditures which were incurred by the government of India, which were wasteful in nature from the point of view of India, because all this expenditure which was incurred by the Indian Exchequer was benefiting the British. They were not in any way beneficial for the Indians, because even if British were fighting wars and taking over various annexing the various areas or taking a lot of booty from the areas which they had defeated, all this money or the resources, they were not coming to India. Rather, these resources, they were going to the Britain. So all this was in a way hindrance to the economic development of Indians. When we see the importance of all these kind of demands which were being made by the moderates against the British, the kind of expenses which were incurred on army and the civil services, they were attacking the very basis of the colonial rule in India. They were attacking the various the kind of systematic drain of wealth which was taking place from India. They were also questioning the ethics or the morality of the colonial rule in India, because British, they always tried to project their rule as some sort of an ethical rule. They always tried to show that ethically they were more superior to the Indians. They also tried to project this view that they were more paternalist in nature, and the paternalism of the Raj wanted to improve the conditions of the Indian, those who had been exploited during the Mughal despotism. So these kind of ideas which are being propagated by the British were totally against the Indians, and the Indians now they realized the true designs of the British. And when the Indians, they questioned the land revenue and the taxation policies, they wanted to weaken the financial foundation of British administration in India. That how the British administration in India, which was based on the kind of land revenue, which was based on the taxation, because Indians had to pay a lot of money in terms of land revenue and taxation to the British. And when this money went to the Exchequer, that money was used by the British for their own purposes. So the British, when they were generating a lot of money from the Indian Exchequer, when they were collecting a lot of money from India, then they were using that particular money for their own benefit. That was realized by the moderates during that particular period, and they also raised all these kind of demands, all these kind of issues which they raised. They also concerned the colonial system of administration and the colonial system of economic exploitation. So all these kind of aspects became quite relevant in the context that Indian political situation had arrived to such a phase where one political party at an all India level had been established, and they were making or raising demands at all India level. So it was, though the critics argue that they were half baked in nature, but even then we'll have to give some kind of credit to the moderates that they were able to raise these kind of demands. One of the historians called Anil Seal, he says that they were a ramshackle set of local linkages whose task was to organize the annual tamasha. Annual tamashas were referred by Anil Seal to the Congress sessions, and Congress was seen to be shapeless and flaccid, and their organization was seen to be loosely organized. The decentralized leadership was there, and amorphous following was also there. So what we see is that a number of historians, especially the Cambridge historians, they have criticized the moderate phase of the nationalist politics. Rather, they have criticized the entire Indian national movement, and the beginning of the Indian national movement was through the moderate phase. And Anil Seal is one of the Cambridge or the imperialist historians who argues that the Congress sessions were rather tamashas. Sumit Sarkar, he argues that politics remained a part-time affair for the moderates and they passed resolutions on some immediate grievances, and they otherwise enjoyed long spells of complacent liberation. They were anglicized, elitist and successful men in their careers and had little time for political activity. So, what we see is that the historians, they have argued that they were part-time politicians. For example, Sumit Sarkar says that they were the part-time politicians. So, we will agree to this fact that these people they belong to different professions. Many of them, they were lawyers, they were journalists, or they were engaged in other professions. But at the same time, we will also have to give some kind of credit to them that they brought these demands to the forefront. And when these people, they brought these demands to the forefront, they were arguing in favor of India. Though they were anglicized and elitist, they were successful men in different careers. They were anglicized, they were elitist as well. But at the same time, these people made some kind of a beginning so that politics in India reaches to that stage where the independence of India could be talked about. And it was also argued, the critics of moderates, they say that their politics was based on negative consciousness, as they were deriving their outlines from British traditions and the political system. And their method of working was also criticized, and it was also argued that their demands remained prominent only at the level of argument and they were not fulfilled. But it is but we should also not criticize their attitude and genuineness, because they were authentic in nature, and the kind of demands which they made and fought for, they were hardly sectional in nature. So, what we see is that historians have diverse viewpoints. Some of the historians, those who are in favor or those who support moderates, they have talked about their positive contribution, and on the other hand, there are others, those who have criticized them, and they say that the kind of demands which they made, they were sectional in nature. But when you make an overall analysis of the demands of the moderates, then we will be able to realize that their demands were all encompassive, they were quite comprehensive in nature, and all these demands which they made they were not only for the people, those who were in India, rather they were also talking about Indians, those who had migrated from India, those who had become indentured labor in different parts of the world. So, their demands were not sectional in nature, though their methods might have been in a way mendicant in nature, their methods might have been criticized, but we should also give credit to them because of the fact that India was under the colonial rule during that particular period, and they were not free to voice their opinions in every way. Rather, the policies which were followed by the British were quite repressive in nature. Another historian, J.R. Macklin, he talks about, he says that the method of the constitutional agitation is hardly an indicator of their timidness, because when they were arguing from the constitutional means, they were not timid in any way, and they also realized that the revolt of 1857 was not all that successful. So, they realized that if they will go for the traditional methods of protest, then they might not become successful. So, their methods had to be constitutional in nature, so that they are able to voice their aspirations, and even then they are not being repressed by the British as it was done during the revolt of 1857. So, they were demanding some kind of self-government at a level. When you talk about the achievements, we will argue that there was a lot of excessive emotionalism was not there. There was not much of impulsiveness in their thought pattern, they were more rational. They also realized the problem of Hindu-Muslim rift, and they wanted amicable relationship through the practical solutions, and that is why you find that Aga Khan, who was a member of the Muslim League, and Gokhale, who was a member of the Congress, their relationship was also quite cordial. So, when we try to make some kind of an assessment of the moderates, we see that their program was quite comprehensive in nature. They were able to tackle the diverse interests, they were able to take into account the various interests at different levels, and the kind of demands which reflected they were also talking about the various sections of the society. As you can see on the screen as well, that they lay foundation of the organized protest against the generations, against the exploitative and the degenerate rule of the British, and their economic critique of colonialism was a scientific analysis of poverty of India. They were also source of inspiration for future generation of freedom fighters. So when you try to make some kind of an assessment of the moderates, we are able to see that they were quite scientific in their approach. They were quite rational in their approach, and the kind of points or the kind of demands which they put forward were in such a way that they could be accepted by the British, and many of the demands which were put forward by them, they were also accepted by the British as well. So they believed in the politics of gradualism, they believed in the politics of the constitutionalism, they believed in the politics of petition, prayer and protest, they believed in the justness of the colonial rule, for which they were criticized by the extremists and the others as well. But they also realized the fact that India was under the colonial rule, and if they will go beyond, if they will go for the traditional methods, if they will go for some kind of a violent acts or procedures which were there during the revolt of 1857, then they will not be able to achieve the objective which was to attain the independence of India. So now I'd like to end the discussion at this point, that we have to situate the moderates within the context of the politics which was there at that point of time, and at the same time we have to realize that India was not independent at that point of time, and their politics of protest had just begun. So the context in which the origin of the moderates, the politics of the moderates, we have to realize the limitations of that particular point of time. So I'd like to end discussion here. Thank you so much.
Okay, I would like to thank sir for this very interesting discussion, and I hope, my dear friends, that you have been enlightened about what the origins or the real origins of the Indian National Congress, and in that form the protest of India's struggle for independence actually began. And on that note, I would like to thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.